Well, Earth, Fire, welcome to CIIS. Sorry about the technical difficulties. I just want to start off by thanking you not only for being here, but for the work that you've done over the last 20 plus years to create this website. You've undoubtedly saved lives. The question is how many, but you've saved lives. I know as a young person, and it's probably true for so many of you in the audience, when the idea of altering consciousness first got into my head, I was terrified and really curious. And it wasn't a question of whether I was going to do it. It was, where am I going to find the information to keep myself safe? And as soon as I had my first computer and access to the internet, the search engines brought me to you guys. And you know, I'm pretty safe. I don't know if you saved my life necessarily, but you helped me interpret some experiences. Your vault of trip experiences is such an important resource that continues to grow, to help people contextualize what their experiences are and put words to the ineffable. So really, thank you so much for the work that you've done. It's an invaluable gift to the human species. Yeah. Can we just thank them really fast?
Well, I'm sure, as you know, it's a big group project. It's not just us, and I can see many faces in the room who know that
many of you in the room have participated in some fashion or another in helping the human species in this way.
Do you have anything to add? Well,
It's hard without the microphone.
let's thanks to the sound guy for working hard to make this equipment work. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
So let's get some history here. The origin story of Erowid. I think you guys met in high school and you went to college together in Florida. Where did the idea for Erowid come from to start documenting the complex relationship between humans and psychoactives? Was it a specific experience, a series of experiences, just who you are, it's in your DNA? Tell us about that.
Yes, and yes. The short answer is it was an accident. And the long answer is, in that exact same position that you were describing for yourself, as a young person being faced with the possibility of taking a psychoactive drug of some sort or another and wanting to research that yourself. We just happened to do that a couple of years prior to the internet, and so to the web. And so
it was 1987. It was 1987, and I, my first week of college, I was offered MDMA and psilocybin and LSD and cannabis and alcohol. And, I said yes to the cannabis and alcohol, and the other things. I was a good student, and I didn't want to ruin my brain, and so I'd been warned about the terrible effects on the brain of taking something dangerous like LSD. And so, I thought, hey, I'd go look that up in the library, and that was really disappointing. And it was not just disappointing; it was disheartening at a level that became, irritated me. I'm driven by irritation.
One of the best options was to, because we went to a fairly small school, to order books through interlibrary loan, which seemed like such a bad idea at the time, to like go in week after week and sign up saying, I'd like to get this book on LSD, I'd like to get that book on drugs, I'd like, 3 more books on drugs this week, please. And it was a little off-putting to try to do that.
But in looking back, so we've been asked this question a bunch, and we've sort of thought about it, and we, at the time, neither of us, we decided in college not to take LSD or MDMA or psilocybin, and we ended up being resources for our friends. We collected books and medical journal articles and things just to try to be helpful for our friends. But at the time, we found that we'd kind of forgotten about it, but we were obsessive compulsive enough that we had made our own software database for managing our reviews of movies we watched, and so we had sitting on top of the TV.
We may have archivist tendencies.
So we were sitting on top of the TV. We had a 3-ring binder with printed out the whole database printed out. Of course, it was on our computer as well. And so There was apparently some issues from early on, but after college, so I graduated in anthropology, and I was interested in native use, had some botanicals, and studied some of the South American use of ayahuasca and the snuffs, varroa snuffs and stuff like that, as part of my undergrad studies. And so I had some books on those, and I had papers on those as well. And when after we graduated from college, we had some kind of crappy jobs for a while, and then we moved to California and decided we were going to start anew in 1994.
So we moved to California. We moved to Skylonda, which is right up above Stanford in the hills in the beautiful misty redwood forests above Stanford. And we didn't have jobs. We just moved out to the Bay Area. We're very close to tech industry. It's obviously tech seemed like probably the zone we were going to be going to. And so I thought, hey, I'll learn web design. Web design's a big thing just right now. Like, people want web pages. We'll learn how to make websites for people. So, but of course, in order to make a website, you have to have something to put on it. It doesn't make any sense to just like have 10 pages. There have to be like links from one thing to another, and it gets you to a new page. And so I started using the data that we had collected about psychoactive drugs as my test sample of data for creating web pages to link together. And then we were on a few email lists discussing psychoactive drugs and consciousness, and people would ask, did somebody mention that paper? And of course we would have saved the paper, and then it was on the website, so we'd point people at it, and so pretty quickly it became a thing of its own, and that's now what we've been doing for the last 20 years. It happened. It was an accident.
We took we ended up taking LSD after we graduated. We waited until 6 months after we graduated because our life was really complicated and busy, and so finally took it, and we're surprised. Terribly interesting, super interesting. Oh my goodness, that was actually as interesting as they'd said. When we were in college, our friends, some of our best friends said, you cannot consider yourself, it was a fairly strident position, but you cannot consider yourself to be a engaged individual who is interested in questions of consciousness and religion and spirituality and global civilization without having had a psychedelic experience. You are just excluding, you're choosing to exclude yourself from this entire area of experience. And I was like, that sounds ridiculous, but that's kind of true.
So it seems like your own intrinsic. Is this working now?
Mine is.
Okay.
1, 2, 3.
Hey. It seems like a combination of your own intrinsic curiosity, your archivist tendencies, and maybe a desire to participate in harm reduction for people who were wanting to experiment with these things. Those were your principal motivating factors? Or?
I would say that the phrase harm reduction has a very specific, it's used in a very particular way, which is not our primary purpose, actually. We are really information and education people, primarily, more than we are harm reduction. I believe that information and education will reduce harms, but if given the choice between publishing a true piece of information, which people could argue could increase harms, I will publish the true piece of information because I believe that in the integrity of the data and that the collection of the data as a whole is what will help to reduce harms in the future.
We think that one of the fundamental problems that our society has had for the last, this is probably everyone knows, most people probably agree with this, but over the last 100 and something years, we've been in an area driven by prohibitionist ideologies that helpfully came out of the women's temperance and voting movements, and those all got kind of complicated. And it was right at the period where the Industrial Revolution made it possible for drugs to be produced in ways that they never had before distributed. And so we've been dealing with 120 something years of prohibition as the default idea that the society's been running on. And so there's been a lot of information that's been hidden and so we feel like we're in a place where we can't really actually know what humans need in terms of the information both, from the individual, perspective of what one person needs to know in order to keep themselves safe, all the way up to the place where high-level public policy makers are having to make decisions on the basis of the documents that they're given, and being able to evaluate whether those are true or not. And our experience and our guests and our meeting people who are in those positions over the last 20 years has made it clear that people in those positions need to have access to accurate, factual documents.
And that those people and individuals and the homeless people on the street and students in the schools, everyone needs to be working off of the same data set. We can't be working off of our own unique, like, there's the data for the people who want to recreationally use a drug, and there's the data for the doctors and the data for the public policy makers. We need to have a group knowledge and fact base which can be agreed upon.
So I've read different numbers of how many trip reports you have submitted to you, anywhere from, I think, 100,000 in the last 10 years to 50,000. What are the numbers, and how do you decide when to post something versus not to post something?
I think that right now we're at about 120,000, 110,000 experience reports submitted. I think the last that we looked, a quarter of reports that get read and reviewed, a quarter of them are accepted for publication.
So probably people know this, but it's a review process. So a report is submitted, and it goes through a first level thing we call triaging, which is some people have to read it. At least 2 or 3 people need to have read it and given it a grade before it goes into the pile that anyone else will see, to then be able to publish. And so we have about 110,000 that have been submitted since June of 2000, and 26,000 something of them have been published for public viewing. And of those which have been read by at least read and graded by at least 2 people, 50% of them are deemed inappropriate for publication for one reason or another.
Uninteresting, completely useless, no punctuation or capitalization.
Wow, hi.
Certainly some of them, I mean, it's 4 lines long and no information of any value. It seems like a complete lie. I mean, there's a wide variety of reasons why we would not publish them. We're pretty, I mean, if you've read the experience reports, you'll see that there are some fairly poor quality things published. So
we have a grouping we call the cellar, which is normal searches won't reveal the things you have to turn them on in the advanced search thing. You have to say, I want to include cellar reports, because we call them an F plus data. It's like it's not really something someone, unless you really care, or there's the substance has so few reports that there's nothing to go on. But we're pretty generous in terms of our grading, but still only 50% make it through.
And then there's a whole lot that haven't yet been read, because 110,000 reports is a lot, and we don't have enough volunteer crew or staff to get through them all in a timely way.
We've been doing a bunch of analysis recently on sort of what things get read and what things don't get read. And the shortest things are the most likely to get read, but they're also the most likely to be bad, like actually like terrible. And so there's this problem where once you get over somewhere on the order of 20,000 words, or 20,000 words, the length of time it takes to evaluate the factuality of something, it's like a 20-page paper or a 40-page paper or a 100-page paper or something like that.
It could be really good, but whoa, it's a time commitment for the volunteers.
It's very difficult to get volunteers to be willing to read for 2 hours, on one person's submitted thing. And so there's this interesting thing where the longer the reports are, the more likely they are to get higher grades. So and there might be a self-selection problem of people willing to sit down and read through the thing. You don't want to. You want to rate it higher because you spend so much time on it. And we don't really know. We're still trying to figure out how to improve the throughput and figure out how to make it so that, like, I don't know if it just gives you an error if you try to submit something that's 100 pages long. Like it sends it to, I don't know. People submit a lot of very long things, and they should. I
I don't want to tell you you're bad, just that you're loquacious.
So, I'm glad you guys have some volunteers helping out, because it
Oh.
seems like more than a full-time job to sort through
Oh,
all of
yes,
that.
yeah. It's a
Yeah,
big
we have
team.
a- we have a
team.
20-person, 20 active triagers at any given time with a manager who manages them.
That's
Training
great.
process to do that,
And people get burned out. I mean, it's very difficult to. I mean, we have one superhero who's read 20,000 reports, but most people who volunteer peter out about 300 reports or so, and we kind of, our best team is kind of in the 500 to 2,000 range, and kind of around 1,000 or 2,000 reports. Most people just it's too much. It's too much to actually be able to maintain an artful attention that it is appropriate to the level of effort that the person
Right.
put into the report.
So, since 2000, you guys have been full-time working on Erowid.org, is that right? And so, that's 17 years of collecting trip reports and writing articles and processing this data. Do you see any new trajectories opening up for the site that you're curious about exploring or moving into?
Well, I think there's a lot of improvements that the world can and should have about access to information and quality of information and clarity of information. And like one of the big areas that the world needs to know more about are things about interactions, and it's a very difficult, very complicated thing, and it can start to head into there's a I am an information architect. I am a database person. I'm not your doctor. And there are lines that are crossed back and forth on forums and on Erowid and other places. And I'm sure that everyone has this experience where you're
recommending
where
or
you're
not
put in a
recommending
position of
combination.
needing to recommend of people taking what are essentially making personal medical decisions that in the worst cases could be life or death medical decisions. And so we're always trying to stay on the side of being librarians, where we're collecting information and trying to process it so that it's useful, but trying not to be in the position of being your medical assistant, because that's a whole
It's a difficult line to hold sometimes, because a lot of people, no matter what you say, won't read the information provided in that way, even if it says all over it, look, this isn't medical advice, this is actually an analysis of experience reports, right? I mean, I can say, this is an analysis of experience reports. 3 people who took this drug with this other drug reported some particular, negative side effect, or reported that a negative side effect was lessened because of that. But people don't read disclaimers, and they don't.
But there's a what I would like is if I were a human and I wanted to take MDMA, and I wasn't super familiar with all of the pharmacology, and I would like to be able to enter all of the supplements and drugs and vitamins and what I've eaten in the last week or month or year, or have my Fitbit or whatever automatically download the data onto my screen and have it give me the good recommendation for the dose that I would take, right? But obviously I can't provide that, because that's one, I shouldn't. It sounds ethically inappropriate. But 2, that we're just heading into, we're just on the cusp of having enough information to be able to start to say some of those things. And there's the precautionary principle, right? There's the idea that when providing medical advice, which of course we don't do because we're librarians, one would tend towards the side of warning people away from things, rather than telling them to do things that could potentially be dangerous. And so while I believe that the world should have simplified access, simplified interfaces to interaction information, it is a very, very complicated set of data to try to present in a way that doesn't get misunderstood. And so that's a thing that so there are sites that we, not exactly partner sites, but peer sites like tripsit.me is great, and Psychonaut Wiki, and Blue Light, and Drugs Forum, and there are some dark web forums that are actually very, very good, where people can have discussions. But in a lot of ways,
I feel like when you're engaged, when you're a person who might come to a thing like this, you're engaged enough, you're a drug geek enough that you can ask the question, and you're in a dialogue about that information. That is a sensible way to interact with it. And once it's distilled down into a super simplified format, then that dialogue isn't really there, and then the people, instead of being, so we provide a drug analysis service is currently called ecstasydata.org, although it should be called something else because it's mostly not ecstasy now. But it's really technically complicated to describe in the end what it is that we're telling you. We're trying to identify the drugs in the samples, but people want really simple answers, and so the
more simple of an answer that you provide easily on a web page someone can read, the more likely that answer is to just end up being wrong.
Because
things aren't that simple.
It's not that simple, and so the people write in who have sent in a sample, and they're like, well, so did you guys test it? You know, do you have a computer or something? You know, an email, I don't mean to make fun of individuals, but a person emailed today saying, do you guys have a computer or something? And I was like, well.
Put the pill in the CD-ROM drive.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, it's a little,
Yes.
it's called gas chromatography / mass spectrometry, and it does involve a computer.
But so I was gonna back away from that and back up a little bit to a slight tangent off of the interactions in answer to your question about what we would do in the future. One of the things that we are looking more and more at is with the flood in the market of such a wide variety of new drugs that it is actually difficult for us to keep up with creating new pages and new sets of data for each individual drug that comes and goes so fast. I mean, there's thousands. And with that, we're now faced with a little bit more of the need for providing information about the types of drugs that you might be taking and the general way that you should people should look at the risks or benefits or the setting issues related to if it's a euphoric stimulant or, so very generalizing the data back out to classes rather than specifically talking about the individual drugs. So it's a thing we're sort of still feeling around because we can't get pages up as fast as there are new drugs coming out. And so what does somebody do who's faced with a drug that there's no good information about? It's like, okay, so we need to now address that issue.
Right, yeah, I mean, what a responsibility, to have that information available as quickly as possible. I feel your motivation to make sure that can happen. So you guys have both described yourselves as drug geeks.
Yes.
What do you see as sort of the existential reasons that human beings are so drawn to alter their consciousness? And why do we seem, at least in the last 120 years or so hell-bent on preventing people from altering their consciousness?
Well, I'll start on the second part. I don't want to draw too hard a line about the Prohibition era stuff that really did, it's kind of related to Industrial Revolution history and the women's vote and temperance movement and stuff. It's pretty complicated, and it's more of a historical accident than I think that it is the default way for humans to relate to plants and herbs and medicines. But I think fundamentally sort of civil societies where we have people very pleasantly collected into cities with high density populations.
In the mountains.
High density populations, you have to be concerned about how much intoxicants. People can drive cars and people can drive buses and fall off things, and so it's important that we as a society think about the ways that we, how easy it is to buy LSD out of the vending machine or whatever on the top floor with no guardrails or whatever, right? There are sensible reasons why society would want to manage the availability of things that alter our judgment. So, why do people want to alter their consciousness? It seems like I wouldn't know what else to do.
All of life is altering consciousness.
I think
everything we do, everything we eat, everything we drink, every movement we make, every time we go running, every time we have a conversation with someone, we are altering how we think and what we think about and the way that the chemistry in our brain is working. It's the brain in life.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I don't make this point too often anymore, but I object pretty strongly to the idea of sobriety, of the sober, of being sober. I mean, I understand that there are, you know, more or less sober thoughts and more or less sober states, but I mean, like, the way that I describe myself is that I'm caffeine sober most of the time. There isn't, I don't know what I would be like. Well, I wouldn't be here. I would be hiding under a blanket somewhere or something. But if I didn't have access to, you know, sort of the normal, you know, foods, and I mean, like, I had to eat a candy bar before I call them candy bars. I had to eat some almonds before I came in here, in order to try to make sure that my mood would be stable enough for me to survive sitting on the stage. And so is almonds, you know, like, you know, gotta have my almonds. You know, I actually, like, that's the way that I think of it. It's so subtle. In some ways, consciousness is super, super subtle, and in some ways, it's super, super gross. Like, you're awake, you're asleep, you're mad, you're angry, you're social, you're unsocial. And that in a lot of ways, I think the oversimplification of talking about a world where there are sort of intoxicants and non-intoxicants ends up being unhelpful. And I think that's why we go with the sort of the broadest term of psychoactives, which is sort of anything that alters the mind. And then we actually broaden that out to say that it's kind of everything. That there isn't anything that we humans experience that doesn't affect. Everything affects our memory, everything affects our brain. It's one of those things where I read in the news a lot, things drive me crazy, that you know, the oftentimes change in the brain is measurable change in the brain is reported as damage. And everything changes the brain. There is nothing that one cannot experience the world without the brain changing. The brain is changing all the time, and so just measuring change is not measuring damage. And it's a medical papers make the error, or they're trying to simplify the story, and the story is really, really complicated.
Yeah. It seems to me that hold on, my battery's died. Is this working yet?
No.
Well, you know, when you look at infants, who they haven't really learned to regulate their own nervous system, their own emotions yet, and eventually they learn how to do that, and then at a certain age, you know, they learn if their parents maybe introduce them to alcohol at some point, and they learn how to regulate the use of that, hopefully, and then, you know, you work your way through other substances. But it seems like there's some form of blockage in our dominant culture. You know, Terence McKenna used to write a lot about this, the way that cigarettes and alcohol and all these pharmaceuticals, which are highly addictive and very dangerous, and you don't use them exactly as prescribed, that's all legal. But then these other substances, like LSD and cannabis and psilocybin, that physiologically can't really do much damage to you, though I get we need to regulate them because judgment can be impaired. But is there something about, you know, industrial capitalism that is filtering out certain types of altered states and allowing us to have other types that foster?
Some states
that
are
culture?
better for keeping people in cubicles, sitting and typing at keyboards. Is that what you're asking? Yeah. Those are
Or
good.
helping them recover for the next day's
Yeah,
cubicle,
or you gotta
yeah.
chill out after the stress of that long day in the cubicle, and I mean, you obviously want to go to sleep so you can get back up, so you can get back in the cubicle.
Right.
I mean, that's true for me. I don't have a cubicle, and I still need my dose. You know, I don't wake up. If the tea's not ready in the morning, I'm just going to be very sluggish and stupid until it's working.
So it seems like we're in the midst of a psychedelic renaissance of sorts. A lot of the research that got shut down in the 1960s is now being done again, and the results are not surprising for people who have tried a lot of these substances, but you know, to see major newspapers and television news networks talking about psilocybin studies coming out of Johns Hopkins, and the MDMA studies for post-traumatic stress disorder, the results are so shockingly positive. Do you guys want to talk a little bit about how you've participated in various ways with some of these researchers in the last decade or so?
perhaps the way I'd like to start on that would be that I think, so who here has ever tried or known someone who's tried MDMA? Good. And so who here is surprised that somebody who has some emotional blockage might find some value to taking MDMA in a therapeutic context? Is anyone surprised by that? Good. So
one of the things that we often say is that the psychedelic research that's going on is fabulous because it needs to be recorded down in a respected place that doubters can look at and believe. But it's not learning anything new. Basically, none of the psychedelic research is learning anything new.
Other than
what
parameterizing and coming up with specific procedures by which you can get the positive outcome. I mean, that's
get
obviously
the most positive
that's
outcome.
new.
Sure.
I mean, we don't.
But they're formulated on. I mean, the research is crafted designed out of the experiences of people who have taken these substances not in a approved, licensed manner, and you get the best of those people together, and you craft your study to figure out what if you wanted to help somebody with a PTSD with MDMA, what should we do? And you got a group of people like this together, and you're like, we should have them in a room that's really nice. It looks nice, and,
Have super
and
nice people.
it's comfortable, and maybe we should pick a really good playlist for the music, and let's make sure they take the right dose.
Light juice drink available. That'd be nice.
Took some experts to figure that out.
Yeah.
So there was like the joke we made about the psilocybin research from Johns Hopkins gang in 2006 when the first paper was published. We knew the researchers and some of the researchers and the guide anyway, and the joke that we made is you take literally the nicest person you've ever met, and you have the opportunity
with the most experience as a guide.
With the most experience as a psychedelic guide of anyone in the world, and you get to take psilocybin and hang out with him for a few hours with really nice music playing. It's like, well, turns out
great positive results.
People had a really good time, and they felt like they really learned something, and they felt like it was a really important moment in their life. It's like, yeah, that's how that's going to work out. So you want to have really nice people. You want to have the right people. You don't want like mean people to supervise. Because the thing is, like, you read the trip reports, and you watch the videos on YouTube and stuff, and there's a lot of like mean college students who are fucking with people who are the first time on acid, and that's, it can be transformative, right? But we might not set that up as the research protocol.
Which, since we're here at CIIS, I mean, obviously the training of therapists is an extraordinarily important part that I think hasn't actually yet, I don't know how you exactly do research into that, because I don't want to compare good therapists with bad therapists with MDMA, right? I don't want to do that research, I don't want to see that research, but that good training for figuring out how to improve and optimize the chances of good outcomes.
Yeah, I don't think the California Research Advisory Panel would approve having half mean therapists and half properly trained therapists. I don't. It sounds unlikely.
So, in terms of the direction that this research seems to be going, it seems like certainly MDMA is going to be medicalized as a prescribable treatment for PTSD. They're doing the phase 3 studies now, and
You never know. Phase 3, things can go wrong.
they can. Fingers crossed. But in terms of how these substances are being woven back into the mainstream culture, do you think that the direction, like using MDMA as an example, moving into a medicalized model is the most appropriate model, or do you see other models? Are you more of a libertarian on this question, or how would you like to see these things be more open and accepted into our society?
I think that it's a really complicated question, because we're not faced with another option currently. That we don't have or should we go ahead with making MDMA a Schedule 2 or Schedule 3 drug and making it available for certain types of medical use, or should we vote for B, full legalization, and anybody can have it anytime they want, right? We don't get that option. So, part of the question is, does the medicalization model make it less likely that the regulated use outside of a medical model will ever be approved, or does it make it more likely? That's yet to really be seen.
One of the things that we often talk about, and this is probably my clipping, I can't tell if I'm doing something bad. Hello, I'm still there.
Yep.
Yeah, good. Is that, as everyone here knows, the vast majority of MDMA use, of ecstasy, Molly use, is done outside of medical supervised contexts. And so most people who have personally transformative experiences have personally transformative experiences at an electronic dance event, at home, with friends, or even possibly in underground, underground therapy. And so, while I think that we completely agree, we want to see of course, anyone who has severe PTSD that is possibly treatable with MDMA should be allowed to go to a medical center where they have the appropriate preparation and the appropriate guide or therapist who helps them through so that they can have an improved life. Of course that should be available, and it's ridiculous that it's not already available if that is an effective treatment, which I think most of us probably guess it is. But still, even if MDMA moves from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 or whatever it is, and is approved for only use in therapeutic medical centers or whatever approved centers, most people are still going to be trying their MDMA outside of that context. And so, in a lot of ways, what we do is what Erowid is involved in is kind of dealing more with most people rather than the medical people. And so it's our own experiences, everyone's here's experiences of taking MDMA have created the knowledge base necessary to move forward with this research, to demonstrate the things that are positive and good and useful and helpful about MDMA. But in a lot of ways, the public's use of it at EDM, parties and stuff is a little bit orthogonal or tangential or something. And so, I hope things that I would hope for that would come out of this is that out of some future FDA approval of MDMA for medical purposes, is that we could move outside of some of the most restrictive procedure, loosen it up, make it a little more casual, and make some more people have access to that, and we would start to be able to ask questions reasonably of the FDA and NIDA and stuff about medical interactions, because there are, so many people are on different types of blood lipid control, drugs and other things like that, and once it's not all illegal, then there might be the opportunity to get proper funding for questions that are a little more subtle than just whether you die or not.
Yeah, it seems inevitable. It seems inevitable that even if these substances are prescribable, that they'll still be used underground, and people will still need to turn to libraries of trip reports and experiences and proper dosages and so on to keep themselves safe. So you guys will not be put out of business anytime soon.
Well, one of the things that's so curious is that, I think that I don't know how many of you here currently work for the DEA, but it's such an odd problem that, as the people who are currently in the the lever control, have their hands on the levers of control of power in this country and around the world, are people who were in the college in the 60s, and they either were exposed to either positively or negatively the subculture wide use of cannabis and psychedelics and things. And so, the numbers are for people in their mid-50s in the United States, somewhere on the order of 91% have used an illegal drug sometime in their lifetime, and somewhere on the order of 85 to 90% have tried cannabis sometime in their lifetime. And so it's not a minority of the population at all. And so where the DEA, are the people who are, let's call them the policy prohibitionists, have continued to keep MDMA completely illegal. It has, and LSD completely illegal. It has created this giant demand for not quite illegal similar drugs, and so there's these euphoric stimulants to pathogens to straight stimulants. So I kind of classify things like straight stimulants are kind of in the caffeine and methylphenidate, Ritalin, that kind of stuff that isn't that fun. And then you get slightly more fun, kind of the methamphetamine to there's euphoric stimulants, and then they kind of cross over depending on the exact pharmacology, into and we'll say MDMA is on kind of the far end of it's the most pushily empathic of all of this group. It's not quite true, but we're in a world where having MDMA be fully strictly illegal means that alpha PHP and alpha, and there's just dozens to hundreds of something between euphoric stimulant and a pathogen available right now, which are not technically illegal to possess, not technically illegal to receive in the mail. And so it's a strange thing. It's like, do we as a society want our children to take MDMA, or do you want them to take alpha PVP? And so, because you don't get the choice of none, right? We've shown that over and over again, that a large portion of the population will continue to violate the rules when the rules are totally stupid.
I was going to back up to your question. That let's imagine a world in which MDMA is approved for medical use in certain settings. The thing about, one of the values of experience reports in particular is that not everyone, even if that's approval happens, people who are taking MDMA outside of those conditions aren't taking them in they aren't all in a room with headphones on and laying on a couch with a friend nearby watching them and monitoring their heart rate, right? That's not how it happens. And so, one of the values of the experience reports collection is that it's surprising with 25,000 published reports, or even the 100,000 that we have stored and can do searches on. Once you have a very specific question and you take a look and you say, okay, right. So we have the question of ketamine. Somebody wants to know something about ketamine's effects if you combine it with, and that's a male. Now we've cut out a third of the reports that we have on ketamine total. So maybe we started with 1,000 ketamine reports. Now we're down to 700 ketamine reports. And we want to know about if you take it in combination with cannabis. Okay, now we're cut down to 400 reports. And now we have the question of what happens if you are on this particular type of drug, or you have, people, I've had a kidney transplant and I'm on anti-rejection drugs. Is that okay to take ketamine with cannabis? I'm female and I have, and I was pregnant last weekend, and it's so quickly get down to such a small number of reports.
You go from what seemed like a lot of reports. It was 1,000. We started with, I don't know what the number is, unfortunately, but let's just call it 1,000 for the simplification. Ketamine reports. Now you're down to 1 or 0, and so
you've got one piece of data.
There needs to be orders of magnitude more first-hand reports that are at least findable, right? It doesn't have to be. They don't have to be fully vetted. We could have a different vetting system. We could have a more collaborative thing. But like I don't know if how many people here have spent time. You're like, I'm looking up something, and so now I'm going to read the blue light, big and dandy thread. How many people have done that? It's a little bit of a pain, right? There's a lot of noise going on there, and it's good, right? It's great stuff, and it's a great conversation, but a lot of times you're not really looking for like a 6-hour research project when you just want the answer to the question that you have. And so we've been doing analysis of experience reports over the last couple of months, and it's amazing how quickly, if you have a 1 or 2 narrowing question, 1 or 2 narrowing factors, that you go from what seemed like a lot of reports to just nothing. You're now in, like, it's just one guy's opinion.
And there's anecdotal data, one piece of data, anecdotal, and
right.
You have 10,000 experience reports. It's not quite so anecdotal anymore. We've been working with a lot of researchers over the past few years, especially as the experience report collection has grown, doing
different types of analysis.
Publishable analysis of experience reports, whether that's looking at a particular substance or looking at cross-substance analysis of the types of words that are used within any given report. You analyze and you say, more likely to have confusion as a word for psychedelics versus love for MDMA, or that sort of thing. It's but more data. We need more data.
More data.
Can I borrow this?
Yes,
Yeah.
you can.
I've been very interested in some theories coming out of a thinker named Richard Doyle, who wrote a book called Darwin's Pharmacy, and he just loaded you guys up throughout every chapter of that book because he was drawing on the trip reports. And his theory is that people's descriptions and attempts to, articulate psychedelic journeys actually ends up creating a sort of feedback loop, so that people who haven't tried LSD or psilocybin yet or DMT, they go and they read someone else's experience, and then they see the machine elves too, right? And it's like we're kind of all programming and reprogramming one another by sharing our trip reports, and in a sense, we're like co-evolutionary, psychonauts traveling into these other dimensions and bringing back these reports. Do you guys see yourselves kind of helping to facilitate with your archives the evolution of consciousness?
Yes.
Fire, go ahead. Add in there.
It's a little hard to argue with that, but I was gonna just riff on that a little bit. That we interestingly have quite a number of people contact us to say, I intentionally didn't read any reports about this substance before I took it because I didn't want to have that, didn't want to create that effect. So it is something that people are themselves aware of. We also sometimes see when a new substance comes out, we can start to see a pattern emerge in the way that people describe it, and it takes a little while for it to settle out. Like we'll see that happening. Like people are like, oh yeah, it does make me feel a little sexy or something like that, and that'll build a little bit, and then over time it's like kind of crashes out and you're like, no, it didn't turn out to be like that. It was just like a little thing, a little sense that it was started being developed within the first few people who wrote reports, and it took a while before we got enough reports to kind of settle out and figure out what it really was like. I mean, it's hard at characterizing, as a organization, as individual people, it's hard to characterize the effects of, especially because they vary so much, of course, but of a new substance or a group of substances.
Well, and even the same, like, it's such a, I think one of the things that I feel like is universal is not universal, that is very common is that, somebody has a really great trip on LSD or something like that, psilocybin, and there's sort of a obvious self-reinforcement where they're more like, somebody who has a positive experience with something is more likely to tell their friends about it and suggest that their friends take it. Well, being around, watching groups of people when I was in college and since then, watching groups of people all take the same drug, not everyone reacts the same, right? And it's not just in the some people are having, thinking about their mother, and some people are thinking about their mother, and their mother's a sad story, and some people think about their father, and their father's a happy story. But physically, some people, like I'm a person who's prone to I forget what the medical term is, but basically my face gets red, right? Like if I drink alcohol or whatever, my face gets red, or if I take LSD, my face gets red. And some people don't have that at all, right? These people, so there are substantial physiological and psychological reaction differences that people can have if you give 100 people the same drug, that the same milligram per kilogram, depending on the drug dose scaling stuff. That there are substantial, medically and psychologically important variations. And so why was I down here? So in terms of the program, in terms of the programming and the idea of so I don't know about machine elves, but what I know is that the ability to turn internal mentation, experiences, ideas, philosophies, unusual moments of internal insight into language. Sort of to turn the ineffable into effing, into friends, something I can share with my friends is very difficult. And so like if somebody provides me some language, machine elves or whatever it is that, or the crystal palace or you know, kind of the universe of eyes, like I think in some ways I feel like the idea space is slightly less polluting to me than like the visual space. Like there's been a couple of times where I, with I think a DMT type thing where I was like, oh, right now, eyes, everything's covered with eyes staring at me. Oh, I finally get why Alex Grade, right, you know, does that all the time. And it never really made any sense to me before. And so now, like I can just very easily point to an Alex Grade painting and say it's kind of like that. Where, you know, if I don't have that language, I don't have that art, I feel like I feel less like it's evolved my own experience more than, I feel like it's more that it's evolved my ability to communicate that. And so I've never had machine elves, but I've definitely been in whatever that world is, you know.
Yeah, the eyes.
Weird. Everything is alive, like everything, really, everything's alive. Oh, that's kind of weird.
Yeah, no, I'm down with that. Everything is alive.
The carpet too.
It's beautiful and it's terrifying, isn't it? So, you know, we're kind of veering into this territory already. You know, in terms of pathways for psychedelics to work their way back into the light of day in our present day culture, because they're certainly pervasive just beneath the surface, right? There's the medicalization model, there's just the legalize everything and, you know, end prohibition outright approach. And then there's this other approach that Native Americans have taken with peyote, and some churches that use ayahuasca have taken, where they've actually been protected by the federal government, allowed to use these substances because it's for religious purposes. And I wonder, it seems like a lot of people have speculated, McKenna of course, that psychedelics, psilocybin mushrooms, other compounds have had a role to play in the birth of human consciousness, human language, human culture, human
Stoned
religion.
ape.
The stoned ape theory. We've kind of moved through a period of secularization. Do you think that as psychedelics do hopefully continue in this resurgence, that we'll kind of rediscover a new form of spirituality?
Wow.
I would argue that that's, I mean, I don't know what we will discover. I mean, I think that has happened and is happening, does happen and has happened forever.
Yeah.
Whether that...
Can it be institutionalized?
Well, so there's religion, which is jump oh, okay. So there's religion, which is history. There's religion, which is spirituality. There's religion, which is myth. There's religion, which is institution. There's a lot of, you know, religion can mean a lot of different things and can incorporate a lot of different important elements that. I think intentionality is really nice to bring to things, and so I think that one of the things that's really great about the Native American Church's use of peyote and the ways that the positive things about the ayahuasca churches is to create a space, to hold a space, to have intention, to bring people together. That's not just a wild ayahuasca vomiting party and
Well, I think that there's a lot of the
spiritual
tradition concept is the wisdom traditions. It's a way of, let's call it institutionalizing, but in my future positive worldview, the spiritual use model is broadened enough to include wisdom traditions that aren't specifically religious or spiritual per se, but are intentional, that are community information and knowledge oriented, that have somebody holding the space so that somebody could go and have an LSD experience in a safe space, but without necessarily listening to dogma of some particular sort or having to join some belief system. But obviously there's a lot of people who find great value in the more specifically targeted spiritual and religious
yeah, I mean,
beliefs.
the United States Constitution includes the word religion, and so in some ways we're in relationship to that and reaction to that, and there's ways in which that I think that's helpful to talk about, and there's ways in which that's not very helpful to talk about. You know, have gone through a phase in my life where I thought it was great. Let's just make everything a religion, because what's not a religion? But in a lot of ways, that's just kind of an unhelpful breakdown of the world to be trying to design my own spiritual understanding of reality in order to try not to get arrested for whatever, for something that no one would. I mean, like I'm in my house and no one can tell that anything's going on inside. No one can tell anything's going on outside because my eyes are closed and I'm lying on a couch, and you can't tell if I'm napping or not, right? That level of criminality. So, so that I think that it's super interesting, and I think that the way that the decisions have come down from whatever the courts about the ayahuasca churches so far have been really interesting and positive, and I'm really excited about that. But to me, I'm not myself a
Group joiner.
And so that I don't. It's not obvious to me that's a necessary or important part. I mean, I believe in community. I believe in being nice to your neighbors, and I believe in being nice to people who aren't just your neighbors. But I don't. My ideal future doesn't make it so that in order to take psilocybin, I have to join a specific church, and there's nothing wrong with singing songs in Portuguese that I don't understand. There's nothing wrong with that, but I'm not sure it should be required.
So I've had these two to myself for about an hour. I'm hoping we have a wireless mic that works so that we can open it up for questions. Is that mic working now, or?
No.
If not, we can just ask people to.
Yep.
Yeah,
All right,
working.
got it.
Great. So yeah, who has a question?
I see a
Let's
microphone
open
back
it
there.
up. We've got someone in the back there.
Yeah, they should man it.
Hi. Just a question on how many of your reports are, or what percentage, I guess, are positive versus negative, or maybe somewhere in between? And how much of a bias do you think there is, since it is self-reported?
It depends completely on the substance with what the percentage between positive and negative is. And I wouldn't be able to give you those numbers off the top of my head for any substance, but I can tell you that there are certain substances like datura, where the reports are generally very cautionary, and it is apparently a thing on the internet to go read the datura reports, because everybody says, I didn't believe it before I took datura, but everybody said don't do it. So now here I am to tell you, don't do it.
So I think the question of one thing that's really important to know is that the published reports on Erowid are not a scientific regular sampling of the entire population, whatever that would be. There are no question they are self-selected. People are way more likely to report unusual experiences, either bad or good, than they are to report their super normal experience. So people don't write in very often. People do, but it's very uncommon for people to write in. I smoked 2 hits off of my vaporizer pen, and I ate dinner, and then I watched the news, and it seemed like the world's really weird. And I took a couple more hits off my vaporizer pen and had a beer and went to bed. And people just don't write that in. That's just not. So what they would write in is if they drank heavily and vomited afterwards and ended up having to be taken to the hospital or something. That's the kind of thing.
But I think they're weighted both towards positive and towards negative. They're weighted towards the extreme ends, and it's obvious that we can see with different substances that some are weighted more towards the negative end and some are weighted more towards the positive end, giving some suggestion in that the likelihood of positive versus negative effects for those substances are differently weighted in that way. But they are self-selected.
Sampling bias, selection bias.
How do you think this information could be used to maybe propose a system with the FDA and maybe pharmaceutical companies to start doing more studies? Because once they reach stage 3 or phase 3 studies, that's when they're really looking for negative side effects, or any type of side effects really. And to say that, hey, look, we have the flip side of what you're not kind of looking for. Is there any way, do you think this could be used in conjunction with quote unquote a real study Or some
It already
studies.
is. The experience reports are already used as a way to help formulate the research that's being done, to look at what the most likely negative effects are and to keep an eye out for those, to analyze new substances and be published, and to publish information about that, which is then used by the FDA, and it's an evaluations of whether something would be studied or not. I mean, they basically are. I don't know exactly what.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, if
More
you're
formal-
suggesting like attempting to try to pick out some particularly unusual positive effect that people don't know about, because like part of the thing with MDMA is it's so well known. I mean, it's not, I mean, one, individuals take a lot of it, two, a lot of people take it a few times, and there are, I don't know how many, I didn't see Matt, is it Matt in the room? How many, anyways, you know, how many total papers have been published on the topic of MDMA in, you know, rats, mammals and non-human primates, and humans? It's a lot. It's 1,000. It's like over 1,000. And so there's a lot of data to dig through, and there's still a lot more that should be done. You know, that what we really don't have is a well-controlled experimental design, or at least epidemiologic evaluation that isn't focused on harms, right? That's the main thing, is that, you know, like the National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIDA, is the #1 funder for research into drugs of abuse, but their primary purpose is to detect and identify harms. They aren't looking for benefits. They don't ask about benefits, and if drugs that they are paying to study don't cause harm, they stop studying them. So, you know, there was a curious, we were talking to some of the heads of the departments at NIDA in 2001, or whatever it was, and I asked, you know, I suggested that they do more research on 2CB, and they said, well, 2CB doesn't harm people, and so I said, well, why does that matter? And they said, well, because our mandate is to study the harms that drugs cause. They go, oh, okay. I mean, it makes sense, but it's, I mean, maybe we should have another organization
Yep.
at the agency
Studies
level
the
that
positive
studies the
The
positive
Drug
effects.
Enjoyment
Yep,
Administration.
that's right.
DEA.
I think it's about 5,000.
5,000. Hey,
Thanks,
Matt. 5,000 papers.
We got a question over here.
Could you please comment on how you could relate content and purity to people's experiential reports?
Ooh, oh yeah, you wish. You'd be living in the Netherlands, which would be nice, because the DIMS, which is run by the Trimbos Institute, they have 27 locations just in the Netherlands, which is, of course,
Physical locations.
Physical
You
locations
can
where
go
you
in.
can walk in and you can have your tablet identified, and if it's a powder, they will test it. If they are certain that it's the same as another tablet, ecstasy tablet,
They'll tell you what's in it and give it
they'll
back to you.
Tell you what's in it and give it back to you. Otherwise, you have to submit it for analysis. But they had, I've forgotten what the number is now, but it is in 2015 they were able to test it and get quantitative information on, I'm not gonna remember, is it 10,000 or 50,000? I'm not gonna remember which number it is, but it's a large number of samples in the Netherlands, and they get purity and quantitative information. In the United States, the only groups that are allowed by rule, secret rule, to put up, to quantify the purity of the drugs are the police. And so we can't do that. We can only publish the list of drugs and their relative amounts in the samples that we test. And we are the only program currently allowed by the DEA to do that, even anonymously. So it's anonymous. So
You can go into a lab with your driver's license and give them a sample and they'll test it for you.
but they
Those
might
people don't want
report you
know.
to the police. So
I would, I think what you're specifically asking, which I'll try to address a little bit, is that, so partially through just our experience of talking to people and general knowledge, and partially through our submissions of samples to ecstasy data, people submit notes saying, I've sent this in because it didn't have an effect, or it had negative effect, or we were surprised at the effect, or whatever, and then we find out what's in it. And so we can do a little bit of comparison from what substances were in the sample to the effects that were found. I think that there are a surprisingly large range of combinations, numbers of substances and some range of combinations that people find positive. So MDMA mixed with caffeine turns out to generally not make people dislike the combination very
Right,
much.
it's
It's a little more stimulating. You can put in a little less MDMA and a little bit more caffeine, and
A couple of the harm
people
reduction
seem to like
groups
that
in
fine.
Europe will report as a caution or a warning when a tablet, an ecstasy tablet contains caffeine and MDMA.
because they consider it contaminated.
Because they consider it contaminated, which is a totally fine way to go, but in a lot of ways, I think that
It's unclear to me that the world population, whether or not the world population might like 10 milligrams of caffeine put in with their 100 milligrams of MDMA better. I don't know that.
You might
I
need a
don't,
little bit
I
less
don't know
MDMA,
that. I
who
don't know
knows?
that it's
I
better
don't-
or worse.
you might might not have your DTs from not having your
There's
coffee.
a few of the sort of research chemical level, newer pathogens that are similarly well liked, although it's very difficult to compare because I think that there is a fairly large group of people that we can't identify exactly who they are, who have never actually had MDMA. They think they've had MDMA, but what they've had instead are tablets or samples that are methadone or some other similar to
Yeah,
MDMA.
before it was banned in the UK, 4-methylmethcathinone was actually got to be more used than MDMA for a couple of a 2-year period, and was considered a better light. People prefer, when given the option of being given MDMA or 4-methylmethcathinone, they chose 4-methylmethcathinone. But that might have been related to the fact that the 4-methylmethcathinone they were getting was almost guaranteed purity.
They knew what it was.
And the MDMA was a little bit dicier.
I don't know if that helps answer the question at all.
It's like over here.
Really appreciate your work. And was curious, one of the things that I found on your website was a survey about ketamine use from recreational users. And you had talked about your contribution to other people's research, but I was impressed that you guys have done, or your folks have done some of your own research, which is, as far as I know, totally unique in the literature and has really contributed a lot to potential harm of really heavy recreational use, which is something that is a big dearth of in the other literature. And I was curious if that's an important part of you guys' mission, if those are efforts that are ongoing, or
Yes, it's an important part. Yes, it's ongoing. No, we don't have enough staff or money to do it as much as we would like to.
One of
That's
the-
true for kind of every sub-project that we have, is that there's so many interesting and opportunities to do research or for things that to be published that would help people, that we just can't do them all. I would love to do more of that.
Erowid has never been focused on the opioid pharmaceutical or recreational drugs. Partially, it's a historical thing that in a lot of ways we felt like when we started in 1995, that those were better covered by the mainstream sources, that the outlandishly negative things that were said about heroin were more true than the outlandishly negative things that were said about LSD. And there was just more information about them, partially because they were available. There was a lot of mood opioid agonists that are available pharmaceutically, and so there was more research. But one of the failure, areas that Erowid is kind of bad at in terms of having harm reduction and risk information about opioids. And so we had we love clinical toxicologists, hooray, yay, yay. So poison control centers, things like that. So we're in love with poison control center people, and some of those people that we're in love with told us that they really felt like we should have some kind of serious effort to make sure that people who go to Erowid and trust Erowid or whatever would not misunderstand the fact that because we don't say don't do heroin, that might mean that we're recommending
That it's as good as every other.
or that it's good, whatever. So we have been working for the last year now with a group of toxicologists, clinical toxicologists who are MDs who train poison control people and stuff and work in emergency rooms, and this group of people is specialists in opioid addiction and overdose and stuff. And so we are just about almost done with the first drafts of all of what these new risk pages that are for the opioid drugs, and then we're going to try to do a series of surveys, and it's not exactly research, but it's sort of
trying to ask people, trying to see what people are willing to read and ask people whether or not, because
One of the things that's really interesting about working with clinical toxicologists is that they are the people who are running the emergency rooms, and so what they see are the overdoses and the people who have addiction problems who come into the emergency room, and so that's a lot of the view of opiates in particular. Probably meth might fall into that same category, but probably opiates most. Is that I do not have a particularly great sense of the responsible opioid users. And so one of the things that we're trying to do as part of this risks project is to accurately portray the risks, present the risks, but also try to do some more research and surveying of our own audience to find out what people's use patterns are and when the problems start to happen, and in order to quantify that a little bit more and figure out that the group of healthy users.
But so it's probably very obvious, but it wasn't 100% obvious before we started that if you are a toxicology expert who is an MD who works in a major city, the people who you get to deal with are mostly poor, or who are the people who wind up with an opioid overdose issue in an emergency room in a big hospital.
Or DXM, we get descriptions from the clinical toxicologists about their view of DXM, because the only people they see see a few people who are heavily addicted to DXM, who are on the sort of homeless side, who end up coming into it's Joe the DXM guy, gets brought in once every 2 weeks, and that can be what DXM looks like to a toxicologist or a doctor, as opposed to the 100 times more people who have tried it twice when they were in high school and everything was fine.
What's DXM?
Oh, sorry,
Cough syrup.
dextromethorphan cough syrup.
Hi. So my question is, are there like new functionalities that you're contemplating for the website, such as new ways to sort of search for particular substances? Like you mentioned earlier, this idea of like, for a particular substance, being able to see, across all trip reports, what are the adjectives or words that kind of pop up most frequently? And I guess like the second related question is, if there was a trending now section of Erowid, what are some of the exciting psychedelics that you've been seeing lately?
It's such a like the trending now thing is we have a thing we've never. We had up live for a little while. You could link it, we could get to it, but mostly it's just been kind of an internal. We call it zeitgeist. It's just this weird little kind of view of the searches that are happening. People coming in on our search engine and people coming in from Google or other search engines. And it's because of the numbers, it ends up being driven by news cycles more than ends up being driven by like interesting things. There's a story about somebody eats somebody's face, right? And they talk about bath salts, right? And even if the guy never took any bath salts at all, that's more likely to drive these big move, like hit lumps. Trending now. I mean, we're a little gun shy about trending now. We've made that, we made the choice kind of about 15 years ago to not really publish trending now stuff, because we found ourselves in the late 90s. We found ourselves several times in a very tight loop that we only realized after it happened a few times, where somebody would say something and we would publish it, and then it would cause somebody, that specific publication would cause a specific person to go and try the specific drug, which then they would write about, which then we would publish, and then that would cause another specific person.
Causing a little bit of like you're saying, the feedback loop. You would get a very small cluster of reports from a small group of people that didn't broadly represent the population's use.
And there was at the moment when we realized it was really problematic was that it was in fact there were a couple of vendors who saw that coming before we did, and so they played us, and so
Advertising.
it was an advertising
Publishing
campaign.
positive experience reports for substances
These
that they
people
were
were
selling.
actually very, very lovely vendors who were providing lovely, 100% pure materials of exactly what they said they were doing, and they did in fact like their materials. It wasn't that they were lying about them, but that's still a commercial you know, their thing.
Product placement.
Product
Yeah.
placement stuff rather than being, I'm a librarian, I'm not really a product placement guy.
We
so
now have
it's-
very specific rules, internal rules about how many experience reports we need to have collected prior to publishing any. So we never publish a brand new substance and one positive experience report, for example, or one negative experience report. We need to have collected a few over a period of time. We are not the cutting edge in terms of where to go to find the brand newest information about drugs. Because we can't keep up, we can't do that appropriately. We can't be as fast.
What's the one we're holding currently? We've got a,
No.
no, it's a. Anyway, we're currently having an internal fight, no, fight is, no, that's right. A debate about what the threshold needs to be for a particular drug. It's not like new this week, but it's new in the last year, but it's been popular enough on some of the forums and it's moving off the shelves. It's one of the IPTs.
4HO and IPT. I can't remember.
Yeah. For us, anyway. So it's a question like, so we have more than just a couple reports, but all the reports we have are positive. So they're not. So there's no sense, like I don't have a sense.
A few of them are by the same person.
A few of them are the same
So
person.
it's
Who's a
not
very good author, a
known.
very well-known author on other sites, and person we published before, and we know the person online, and there's enough information that we're it's on the edge of like at what point are we promoting a thing rather than just documenting it? And so like by kind of dragging our feet a little bit, we try to fall on the documenting it side rather than the promoting side. And that's a weird decision point that we're faced with 10 to 50 times a year.
Does someone have the mic still? Or?
Yeah, I have the mic here.
Stand up. Where are
Hello?
you? Oh, there you are.
My question to you is, on one end, there's like a trip report where like, I took acid and it was fantastic, and that's probably not going to add to the compendium of what is necessary to have, or maybe it is. But I guess, could you speak to like what is important, like what constitutes an important trip report? Like what are the data that is most useful for you to be collecting?
So I would say that at a very basic fundamental level, so let's say for a brand new substance, dosage, timing, general level of effects for the dosage. So that's sort of just the basics that for the brand new second person duration. For the second person who ever tries it, those are just the sort of key basic bits. But then I would say that I took LSD and I enjoyed it. I would easily collect 100,000 more reports that say that, because also I took LSD and I didn't enjoy it, would slip in there at some percentage, and then we would have the larger scale data to analyze to say,
The fact is that
a
we
large
don't, like,
percentage of people-
a huge number of people, and we don't know the exact number, but the huge number of people, millions of people took LSD between 1963, 62, and 1972 or whatever, and we have really very little epidemiological data about what those people, like, or self-report or historical or anthropology, we don't really know what that population as a population really thinks about having done that. We don't know what they think about it at the time. We don't know what they thought about it at the time. We don't know what they think about it now that they're
This might answer the previous question a little bit. One of the areas that we really would like to be working more in is collecting information from people about what they think about the experiences that they had retrospectively as youths, as people who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. What did you think about the fact that you chose to do LSD first when you were 16 or 18 or 20 or 22, and what was that like, and do you think that was a good choice or a bad choice, and how has that affected your life over time?
I would really like to see this obviously we get a little intrusive, but you're a survey participant, so we're gonna be a little rough, but every year or every 6 months or every month you get asked the same question of sort of what do you think of it, and watch that change, like, as people have kids, just like, oh, I'm not so sure about it. Maybe the age of consent for LSD should be 25 because my kid's, 19, and now it should be 27 because they're 25.
One of the really interesting things about the is it Monitoring the Future, or is it?
Monitoring the Future, probably.
Monitoring the Future is one of the two big studies that sort of mainstream studies that asks people about their use of psychoactives in the past. And they have followed a specific group of people over time and continued to ask them as part, they ask all sorts of questions. It's not only drugs, it's questions, all manner of questions. And so they continue to ask them over time, have you ever taken LSD? Have you ever taken MDMA? Have you ever taken an opiate, cocaine, whatever? And there's a recanting rate that happens sometime around the 30. So your career is starting to take off. People start answering, no, I've never taken cocaine, when they have previously 3 times in a row said, yes, they have taken cocaine.
And the recanting rates are different based on different job groups. So like people who go to join the police or become lawyers are more likely to recant younger youth. And so anyway, it would be lovely to see a really deep and wide and full questions about what people think over time, like when you're in college and then when you turn 30, when you have kids and you get or don't have kids and you go middle age, and then as you age and as you head into kind of the end of life, kind of like one of the things that we tried for a number of years and just failed horribly over and over again was to try to have workshops and have discussions about the kind of the trends, how to teach the next generation. How do you talk to kids about teens and young people about psychedelics? I mean, they're pretty complicated.
And we've been surprised as we just travel around and speak places and talk to people at how many people who are dyed-in-the-wool drug geeks, people who have incorporated lessons from their use of psychedelics into their lives, who say, I have never talked to my 15-year-old about any of this. My 15-year-old understands cannabis to be bad because of their experiences in drug classes in school, and I just haven't known what to say about it, so I haven't said anything. And it's been really surprising to us
and it's obviously complicated. There's all sorts of every jurisdiction in every area and every subculture and every culture has a different reaction to parents talking to their kids about cannabis or LSD or MDMA. But one of the this vision that I had, vision's not the right word, but just an idea that I had during one of these workshops was maybe there's a sense in which it has to skip a generation. Like in some ways, maybe the grandparents are the right people to talk to the young kids about it, because there's a way in which it's too much like talking about sex for parents to talk to their kids about MDMA or LSD.
And there's also security issues of talking. I mean, people hesitate to talk to their younger kids about their own use, about the parents' use of psychoactives, because you don't know what your kid is going to say in the wrong situation, because they don't understand what the repercussions can be. And so it's a little bit easier to do that if you're a 70-year-old.
Grandpa with gray hair says, "Oh, I tried LSD, sure, it was weird, yeah." Whatever Grandpa says, I'm not suggesting any specific story, but it's definitely it's a very one of the things that I joke. I mean, this is my job, and this is whatever. I'm archivist, and I run. I fight robots all day long, but a lot of what we touch on, and I think that the reason that people are here and the reason that you're interested in this is that there's a way in which these psychoactive tools, these technologies, these drugs touch something at the very core of what it is to be human. That the idea that there is who we are and what decisions we make and how we feel and how we love and how we share or hold back are so deep into the questions of what consciousness is and what decision making is and how we is this me or is this something else, or in a lot of ways that these tools bring those questions up in a way that most tools just don't, right? And so we become I feel like the question of how to relate, how to tell a story to a 5-year-old or a 15-year-old or a 20-year-old or a 50-year-old about what it's like to be on MDMA, or what it's like to feel a heart-opening sensation, or forgiving all of the people who've ever done harm to you, or to feel truly a part of the world, or to have the universal light kind of pour through you and be like, oh well, didn't expect that. It's a deep. It's really deep. Like it's not like the questions of. It's not just like the question of whether where to put the freeway, right? To me, public policy questions about how to relate to psychoactive drugs and psychoactive technologies, which I think that I don't want to be too sci-fi and spacey, but but not very far in the future, LSD might seem like a stone axe, right? That it might very well be that we're not 10, 20, 100 years from now, we're talking about digital technologies and software being the drivers of what consciousness alteration looks like. And so, anyway, I wanted to just make sure to make the point that there's a way in which this stuff is so deep and so fundamental to what it means to be human that I feel as if the society has done a very poor job of trying to even mention that, let alone actually come to terms with what that means.
I've really enjoyed, I just read an article, most of you probably know Amanda Fielding from the Beckley Foundation, doing research in Britain, psychedelics, MDMA, LSD. She used the phrase, I'm gonna not quite get it right, but rigidity softening or rigidity breaking for psychedelics, which I hadn't quite heard that term before. It was in discussion of use of psychedelics to help with therapy, to help, again, in PTSD, or like to break out of cycles, to the rigidities that can form in the way that we think or in the way that we act or the way we address particular problems, that rigidity breaking, opening, and I think that just sort of that made me think.
Yeah, the most important medical advice I ever received was from a chiropractor. Who he said that the primary thing to stay healthy is to keep it moving. You don't want stuff to freeze up and get locked up, and you need to keep stuff moving. And there's a lot of ways in which I think that that LSD and psilocybin and MDMA can help free things up and get things moving that are stuck.
Someone has the mic.
Hi, how's it going? Over here.
Oh.
there.
Hey, how's it going? Yeah, thank you. Been my resource for probably 14 to 16 years, and I love what you guys do. My question is kind of in the same vein of teen drug use and kind of in the spectrum of what's legal and what's not, which compounds. So, you have this problem of bath salts and all of the synthetic marijuana or whatever that kids are using, and it's basically just one kind of atom or one kind of compound off that makes it legal, and a lot of that stuff is being made in China. Do you think that kind of, these policymakers who are pretty much running chickens with their heads cut off about a lot of these kind of new compounds, do you think that they might turn to these online resources such as Erowid to kind of get their heads around kind of what might be the tried and true hallucinogenics and things that people take, and maybe that might lead to medicalization and legalization?
I definitely think that I can't imagine how an intelligent, thoughtful policymaker couldn't have at least an inkling of the fact that there are 6 or 8 or 10 psychoactive substances which are, let's call them the classic most popular. So we've got LSD, we've got psilocybin, we've got cannabis, we've got MDMA, we've got methamphetamine, we have some stimulants, some psychedelics, some downers, some whatever. And that if those were legal
or less illegal,
if those were less illegal, half of the people who try the new things where they're complete guinea pigs would just not try the new one. And the likelihood of the new substance being safer is...
That's not the selection criteria.
That's not how the system works. We don't have any idea whether they're safer or not safer. And so if you take a substance like LSD or psilocybin, where roughly no one has ever pharmacologically died due to pharmacological effects of those substances,
it's tricky to meet that bar. That's a high bar to set for a drug. So, I think that
they've got to realize it to some degree. They have to think.
I've been hopeful. I think that my hope, I'm not going to talk about politics, but sometimes my hopes are dashed, and I have been hopeful that it's a little harsh, but the dying off of the generation of people who never met anybody who had ever taken LSD or smoked pot, or thought that they hadn't,
that would create the opportunity to, to have people in the positions of power, the senators and the presidents and things like that. I mean, Barack Obama described that he smoked pot in high school, and he overstated a kind of slightly negative, juvenile, stupid, view of it, but at least it was part of his experience, and there was a way in which people in top positions would be making decisions on the basis of having some knowledge rather than being totally fucking clueless, which is obvious when, oh my goodness, there was a Senate panel in May where, so Dr. David Nichols, who some of you know, used to run the nice LSD lab in Purdue, he was called to talk about the new synthetic drug epidemic or whatever it was, and it's so telling and depressing to listen to the questions that he was asked, because he's a PhD chemist and pharmacologist, and he's a very articulate and smart person, and the person who's asking him the questions
So where would someone get the recipe for making this new drug? He's like, well, we've published about it. That's part of what we do. We publish in peer-reviewed journal articles. He's like, but you didn't actually publish the recipe for it.
You wouldn't publish the how-to recipe for it. He's like,
well, the methods that would have been published, yes, but you didn't actually tell people how to make it, right? And he's like,
I guess no. Anyways, it's very obvious that the people who are running the subcommittee on the new synthetic drugs, they don't understand the basics of the topic area that they're talking about, and so obviously it's harsh to make a good policy if you don't actually understand the difference between yes and no.
So, can someone have the mic, or are we?
I just have a quick question, Earth. I'm curious about your pendant. Is there a story you'd like to share?
This is a Klein bottle opener, right? So this is a Klein. We're doing a little advertisement piece now. So that this so Klein bottle is like a Mobius strip except a tube instead, and so there's no inside and outside, and it's a cute little thing, and so it's printed. But it's made into a beer bottle opener. And a friend gave it to me for Solstice, it's a little big as a pendant. It's obviously not really a practical size, but
very convenient.
Exactly.
Highly esoteric as well.
Hi.
There we go.
I was wondering if you could reflect on information technology. I think it's interesting that you started your career just when the internet was beginning, and you mentioned where you think technology is going in relation to psychedelics or psychedelic experience. If you could just talk about how you think about this technology and maybe how you think it's affected our relationship with these substances.
Information or about psychoactive technologies as psychoactives themselves? You meant the first.
I meant the first.
Okay.
But you can do both.
So one of the things that I think, unless you are in computer security or spam management or otherwise, you probably don't know that we have been in a period for some years now of chronic, ubiquitous blizzard of robot wars that just beyond whatever interface you currently have available to you is a battle of constant stream of everything that can talk is talking, and a lot of those are talking in ways that are intended to probe, test, break in, destroy, learn, take over, whatever, and that is so the world that I live in is mostly dominated by command lines. I have screens full of little tiny windows that are SSH logins to watching whatever scrolling things go by and watching monitoring. I have web screens that are sort of showing levels of traffic in reds and greens and yellows depending on whether or not we think that there's
currently trying to break in.
How many different things are currently trying to break into which systems, right? And so that's normal. That's the normal world if you work in computer security stuff. And so
it's hard for me to, like, when I think about information technology and stuff like that, information technology is now kind of the normal thing. It used, when I was a kid, you know, we're in the 70s, you have a computer, I've got a computer too. It was unusual to have, you know, a bunch of screens in your living room, and now it's unusual not to have a screen in your pocket, right? And so
I would say that one of the way that we have long thought about our work in relation to the increase in use of computers and the increase in access to information of all sorts, both good and bad, is, in particular around psychoactive drugs, is that there's clearly a learning stage that our societies and our culture and our humanity needs to go through to figure out how to deal with that. Because in a similar way to what I said earlier about our primary action is not harm reduction, and we are primarily information publishers and fact providers, we realized 15 years ago that it might be the case that for some period of time, and maybe that's the rest of the time that we are alive and working on this, there are a lot of harms that come from providing access to a lot of facts to people who aren't used to having those. That there's risks will be taken. It might increase people's use. We're not entirely sure what will happen. What happens when you give everybody access to all information? People aren't used to that. 15 years ago, people didn't have that. What does that learning curve look like, and do we get better at having access to? I mean, this year it doesn't feel like it. Yeah.
One of our detractors in early 2000s, who is now a friend of ours, thought that, you know, doing what we did was increasing the use by young people, you know, sort of people in their kind of, you know, 13 to 16 range of trying, you know, taking psychedelics or new drugs or whatever. And so he did a small pilot research study. It was very small, and so, but what he did was he published a paper about it too. And what he did was he sort of had his experimental subjects look at a variety of different web resources about drugs. And the ones who had access to he gave access to the NIDA website or the DEA website, or I can't remember what governmental sites it were, and then he gave some of them access to Erowid, and then sort of studied them for a little while and asked them questions about what drugs they used and how they used the drugs and stuff. And what he found was that access to Erowid changed people's changed what drugs people tried first, and how much they knew about them before they started. But it didn't.
Surprisingly enough, people sought out information in order to try to reduce harms.
Right, and so the primary thing that the kids were trying to do was try to not hurt themselves. And so he was like, okay, you're right. It's actually we should probably provide them answers to those questions.
Any questions in front?
Oh.
So thank you so much for your work. It's been very appreciated. Shulgin had his magical half dozen, and I was wondering if you guys had your own special substances that, you know.
He said that we were going to get asked that. I said we don't get asked that often.
I hope it's okay.
We do.
What are your favorite drugs?
My main answer always has to start with, you know, it seems a little obvious, but you know, caffeine and alcohol. I have chronic insomnia issues, so I'm always trying to change up which things I'm trying to take, whether it's, you know, valerian or skullcap or zolpidem or Xanax or something like that. But they don't really qualify as my favorite drugs, but the idea of living without some kind of a sleep drug somewhere in my world sounds nightmarish. So I always, the main thing I always go to is psilocybin. I think psilocybin is it grows itself, right? I mean, it's a little hard to, it's like you can spray fungicides on it and it still comes back, and it's very difficult to kill mammals with psilocybin. It takes a
It
lot.
seems to be sort of self-regulating. A lot of people, if you take psilocybin a few times in a row, maybe I shouldn't take it. It's told me not to take it again for a while.
I know people, I've met people who've had a little bit of trouble, managing their own use. They've, kind of gone down the rabbit hole with psilocybin and failed out of school and stuff. But most people I've talked to that, sometime around the third time in a month when they take psilocybin, the mushrooms, they do not come back. This is not appropriate behavior. It can get very judgmental, and so psilocybin, I think, is a substance that it's very difficult to kill mammals with. It grows itself, and it's super interesting. Careful.
There have been a lot of really great questions about how to use the information on Erowid, but I was just wondering, what is the daily, what kind of things do you do on a regular basis? What is an average day or average week like?
What does our work look like?
Well, let's see. This morning, we were working on ecstasy data issues. We manage a anonymous submission testing service. We send a sample to Sacramento, and you have to send either $40 to $150 depending on the type of sample, and it's a little complicated. It's a little more complicated than it should be, but questions of what to do about when no drugs are detected in something, right? So that's hard. Like you've got a crystal. It says the machines say nothing. Right? It's like, well, okay, that's a little weird. Something's obviously there. So we've been working with the lab because of DEA restrictions. We have certain things we're not allowed to do. But the lab in the last couple of months developed basically a crystalline sugar test, so that if we come back with no drugs detected, can we say yes or no, this contains crystalline sugar? And we've got a test for that, and now this week we have a test for table salt. So like no drugs detected. I'm going back, and they're retesting a couple of samples that were no drugs detected, and it's like, well, one of them was actually just table salt, right? So that's interesting, sort of.
Communications with researchers.
Yeah, we manage volunteers like
volunteers.
Many times a day. We have a chat channel that the team hangs out on. This last week, a week ago? Was it a week ago? It was 2 weeks ago. A paper was published by the Trimbos Institute guys, the Dutch drug testing service, and it caused a little bit of a hullabaloo on some of the darknet vendor forums, because let me see if I can simplify this. Some of the vendors were claiming that quantitative analysis that showed that their MDMA was 84% pure meant that it was 100% pure because the standard that was being used was MDMA freebase, not MDMA salt. So when you have MDMA, it's the active part of the compound is the part that's active in your brain, but in order to make it a crystalline solid salt,
you can make a variety of different salt forms.
There's this other part, the anion, the HCl part, which is mass in your MDMA powder or crystal, that is not active in your brain. Well, the question is, do you put your standard at MDMA freebase, or do you put your standard for weight at? So anyway, is 84% 100%? Or is 84% 84%? And so
it turns out it depends on which lab you're talking to. So the Trimbos lab, in fact, 84% is 100%. And so they were in fact correct. Every sample that they reported saying this is 84% pure MDMA was in fact 100% pure MDMA hydrochloride.
So if the Dutch people
but most other labs don't report it that way. Most other labs, if they had 84,
let's go to milligrams. So if the Dutch people say that they've got 84 milligrams of MDMA, what they mean for most people is 100 milligrams of MDMA. And so our lab and energy control in Spain and a couple of other testing services that are in Austria and Switzerland all use MDMA hydrochloride salt as the standard for quantitative stuff. And so
Making it 100%, making 100 milligrams be
so if you have a little
100
baggie full of MDMA, you could reach 100%. So the Trimbo says that's 84% pure. So it's a technical designation, but it's the kind of thing where I just wanted to make sure that all of the players who are doing the quantitative testing know what each of others. So I do not myself run analytical testing equipment, but I help communicate between those people who do. And so that was a little communications thing that I did last week.
We meet with researchers, or we've been meeting with our
phone
opioid
meetings. Lots of phone
meetings
meetings. I love phone
with the
meetings.
toxicologist group, where we're doing research on opioids. I get up every morning and I read the news about drugs that come in through my various searches, and I run the Erowid Twitter feed, and so I publish what I think is interesting about what I've read that day. That's the first thing I do in the morning.
I clean spam filters. I watch for error. I watch for error if there's. I try to group errors and if there are errors that are happening commonly, I try to figure out why and stop them.
Manage the to-do list of new things that should be published about, and working on the next issue of our newsletter, the extracts, and so writing articles, writing about various drugs or things that are happening on it.
Back channel fighting. I don't know how many people here have edited a Wikipedia page. Okay, all right. So then if you've had the experience, there can be what are little sort of editing fights or fun, joyful experiences that where you can have an argument about what the right way to state a fact is, or what the fact is on certain things. And so we don't have enough staff to pay people to edit Wikipedia pages, so instead I manage people who edit Wikipedia pages, and so I try to be in communication with some of the main people who do the most edits on psychedelic related or new drug related pages, so that at least we're in communication, and we know what we think. If we disagree, we know
you know where the points of debate are about
right.
what the effects or risks or whatever.
And do you call a designer drugs or synthetic drugs, and is it appropriate? It's like that's who cares? It's no harm.
Communicating with people who write in lots of questions and ask us all manner of things, and so
trying to right. So I would say one of the major daily things is triaging, meaning sorting incoming questions and deciding whether or not they rate to whether some staff person needs to answer them, whether they can get a canned reply, whether
they really should have just read the website.
Whether they right. And so like how mean do you be? Our policy is to always be nice, never be mean to people. If you can't say something nice, just don't reply. But but it's tricky, People are very there are a lot of people on the web, and a lot of them are really pushy and expect more than I think one of the things I feel like we have helped to do with Erowid is we have helped increase people's baseline expectation for what they should be able to find online as far as factual information about drugs. And it is, if you start with if you're 15 years old and you're like, okay, well, everything's online, and so I go to look for it and I don't find exactly what I'm looking for, and now I'm pissed. And so I'm going to write into any or 10 addresses all at the same time, or fill out any forms, and the tone
insult us for not having published that
being
piece of information.
insulting, and so then the moment is like, does this person have a valid point? Is there a way we can provide them pointing to the resource in an efficient manner, and how do we be nice? And almost always, not always, but almost always replying nicely to somebody who is in a bad mood will make them happy, and we get positive replies back. So,
and then of course all of the management of staff management, payroll, fundraising, donor communications, all of those sorts of things
running a small business
are required for being a nonprofit.
Erowid is a 501c3 nonprofit who's it runs entirely on the voluntary contributions of people.
This will be the last question we take.
Hi, thank you so much for your work. Very grateful for the resource that you're providing. And it's kind of to that point that you were just mentioning. I think the ability to share information, the ability for this information to live out there, it's incredibly important. And the scientific and kind of reason-based approach that you're taking to this archival effort seems to be sort of the thing that would now be under threat more than ever. And I'm just curious, what threats, if you could speak to the threats that you've faced in the past, and also kind of the safeguards that you're thinking about, perhaps, to guard this kind of precious, I would say, precious resource going forward.
There's a variety of angles to come at that from. We have had surprisingly little contact from law enforcement. For
Direct,
example.
direct,
That's
explicit.
one of the questions that we get asked a lot. Basically, never have we been directly contacted by a police officer or a law enforcement agent of any sort telling us to do something or asking us something about our work. We've had a few extraordinarily suspicious communications. The one that comes to mind was probably 10 years ago now, but we got an email from someone just fairly bluntly asking whether we knew of a source for
some unusual DMT seed, I think. It was some...
Or maybe coca seeds.
Coca
It was
seed,
coca seeds.
right.
And I don't think that we generally don't reply to any questions like that. What we might reply saying, we do not provide any information about that sort of thing. But and then like 2 days later, we got an email from someone saying, I have bulk coca seeds for sale. Do you know anybody who might want to buy those? So we've had a few things like that.
One of the simplest things is that when we first started this in the 1990s, it seemed edgy and cutting edge and scary, and we were nervous about it, and we spent time consulting with lawyers about our rights and sort of where the edges of the First Amendment lie and all that, and mostly that shaped the main and in the end an ethical precept rather than a legal precept, which is don't recommend things to people, just because it's not really ethical or appropriate to tell people you don't know what to do, right? That's stupid. So legally that's a good idea too. But now we're kind of boring. We're really if you were interested in law enforcement stuff, I have a whole lot of better places to start than there's the Tor web, the kind of, it's called the dark web sometimes, but you have to require this Tor software in order to be able to use your browser to browse that portion of the web. There is no dark web. That's all. The idea that Google has it fully indexed. There are big indexing projects.
It's not hidden.
If anyone thinks that dark web is dark, you're a little bit confused. But the
concerns like that have led us to do things like having our own. We run our own servers, so we don't use any. We're not in
cloud.
We're not cloud. There's nothing. It's all on our own private servers run by ourselves and our security team in a locked box that we have the keys to.
That legally, obviously, there's if you can't. Using the internet is doing something public. There's a public action. It's not a fully private. You're not doing a private communication where you huddle in secret in the corner and whisper into each other's ear. That's not what the internet's like. And so, the fact that we own our own hardware and we have our own key to that doesn't mean that no one could ever get access to it. It means that in order to have legal access to it, a judge has to go and get an order to, or at least, or a security letter, whatever. But we are the people to whom that would be served, and so that's one step that we take. We do a lot of backups. We have a lot of off-site backups at a lot of different locations. A lot is too many, but in several different locations. Mostly my like 10 years ago, I felt more strongly about all the things I just said about backups. Is that there are so many robots. I would say. Every day, at least 3 robots scrape all of Erowid, and Google notes a change within several hours because they scrape all of the headers of every page of the site every day. Yahoo, Bing, bot, and so the information is going to be very difficult to delete as it currently stands.
10 years ago, that was more of an issue.
I think my concern would be if I were concerned, which I am not, about the future of the project of trying to evolve information and understanding and wisdom, is about taking the sale, taking. We can talk about that for just one moment because obviously this is going too long. But taking the wind out of the sails of the kind of the open source, open wisdom ethos that has helped drive the production and distribution. I want people to share. I want people who are 60, 55 to 80 to feel like they should tell their stories to their grandkids or to their families, or at least somehow to make sure that whether they had a good time or a bad time or a neutral time when they took psychedelics when they were young or when they were old or MDMA, that they tell those stories, because I feel like we're at a point where we could lose an entire generation of wisdom if people feel, which they do, I don't.
If people feel
If
more,
people
if
feel
there's more
if
fear
people feel
around
unsafe,
scaring,
if
from
people feel
sharing.
unsafe sharing. So I just jump to this weird. Oh my God, it's so weird. Everything's so weird. It's so close to me. In October, I was having dysphoric experiences around watching the television, and there was some kind of voting thing going to happen, and I had this moment where I started talking about the fake news. They started talking about the fake news thing, and I realized that I've spent my entire, I have this little vision that I've spent my entire professional life, the last 20-something years, basically working against fake news. Because when we started Erowid and when we were dealing with drug information in the early 90s, what we were up against was fake news. What the government agencies were publishing was false.
And another Partnership for Drug-Free America.
Partnership for
that was who had the first
they were
websites
just
with
lies. It was total lies. Like up through the early 2000s, where and you can still find this reflected in places, but under hallucinogen dangers, heart and lung failure was listed as the number one thing. And so what they were talking about, I think, was PCP. There was maybe this weird article from the 1970s about heart and lung failure associated with PCP use. And so then they extrapolated that, of course, to all hallucinogens and all psychedelics. And so on the LSD pages for all of these sites, it's just fake garbage. So in this way, we've been dealing with trying to.
We're bracing.
So we're
in case
a
there's
little braced,
more fake,
at the moment.
Fake fact.
No alternative facts.
Lies. Yeah.
Lies.
Paul?
Standards of evidence. Have standards. Set standards for your evidence, and try to keep them growing stronger.
Thank you so much for being here with us, Earth 5.